is a woman in 1800s London. It's not easy to be her, particularly because in this book she's also queer. What are you actually saying, you privileged misogynistic man? I don't get it. Hi my lovely readers and queers, welcome back to my channel. I am Franny, and today I have a very interesting video for you, if I say so myself. I don't know if I'll be able to pull it off as much as I would like to, but in today's video I would like to talk about a book that I've recently finished, and that is Most Ardently by Gabe Kolnovoa. But not only, I would like to tell you what I thought of this book, my opinions, what I liked, what I disliked, but most importantly, I would also like to put it up against another book that I've also recently finished and already talked about on my channel. And from this comparison, I would like to ask you a question that I don't have an answer to. I do not have a stand. There's nowhere I'm coming from. I am genuinely interested in discussing what the two faces of the coin are to me and what you think about it. I would love to hear from you. I would love to discuss it with you in the comments down below. And that question is, what is for you a retelling? What makes for you a good retelling, and what is the sort of retelling that you are seeing more out there and the kind of retelling that you enjoy more reading? And also, if you would like to keep talking about it in the comments, what is your favorite retelling that you've ever read? I would love to know. But before we get to all that, let's begin from the beginning and go back to Most Ardently. Most Ardently by Gabe Kolnovoa is a queer young adult retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and it is the 9th book in the Remixed Classic series, which is a series where different authors write retellings of classics that are queer, diverse, and aimed at a young adult audience. Now, when I say that Most Ardently is a retelling, I mean it in the most literal way possible. Most Ardently is the Pride and Prejudice that you know. The only difference, which of course is a very important key difference, is that the main character in this story is Oliver Bennet. Oliver Bennet is the only Bennet son, even though to most people he's known as Elizabeth Bennet, who is the second eldest daughter in the Bennet's family. However, due to the fact that only a very selected few, which includes Jane, Oliver's aunt and uncle, Charlotte, and her lover Lou, know that Oliver is actually Oliver and not Elizabeth Bennet, most people throughout the whole book still refer to him as Elizabeth, which of course is very terrible and traumatic to the main character. He has to stay in the closet, he has to live a life that he's not comfortable with, that creates gender dysphoria and so many things. But it's a very important key element to remember throughout this video for what I'm about to say. And what I will say in this video is, again, that Most Ardently is Pride and Prejudice, which at first was kind of endearing. It appealed to my deeply nostalgic soul, and I think it's a very understandable feeling for readers who loved Pride and Prejudice, who loved the movie, the 2005 movie, of course. You love that story, and so if you find yourself rereading it with a few elements here and there that are kind of twisted, slightly different, slightly, edgy and original, then you're happy and you enjoy the reading experience. So on one hand, there's definitely all that to consider. On the other hand, there's the fact that it got to a point where it was too much. Of course, any worthy Pride and Prejudice retelling has to find a way to start with the famous quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged." That has to be there. You're expecting it, you're happy when you find it, and you enjoy to see what twist the author put. And of course, it was no different in this book. The moment I started listening to the audiobook, the moment I heard that first sentence, that quote, I was happy. You will see what I mean. I'm going to read it to you. "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single boy in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a future wife, unless that boy was Oliver Bennet." So it's already set in the mood, it's set in the retelling vibe, it's set in the Pride and Prejudice vibe, and you're loving it, right? But the more you go on, the more annoying it gets. And let me explain to you what I mean. The book starts with the Bennet sisters and the Bennet brother dressing up for the Meryton Ball. And then they go to the Meryton Ball where they meet Darcy and Bingley for the first time, and Bingley dances with Jane, and Mrs. Bennet tries to tell Oliver to dance with gentlemen around, and of course Darcy says that there's nobody he's interested in dancing with. Oliver hears Darcy saying that to Bingley, of course, and takes it as an offense. And then you have Mrs. Bennet telling Jane to go to Bingley's house, and she has to go on foot because the carriage is busy for whatever reason, and she gets sick, and so she has to stay there for a few days, and Oliver goes to stay there for a few days because he has to take care of Jane and all of that. And then Mr. Collins comes, the Netherfield Ball, and you have Mr. Collins dancing with Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth dancing with Darcy. And then you have the iconic scene of Mr. Collins coming to the dining room to ask all the Bennets to leave but Elizabeth, and then you have Oliver obviously refusing him, and then Mr. Collins goes to ask Charlotte to marry him, and Charlotte of course does. You even have the dinner at Lady Catherine de Bourgh place, where Lady Catherine de Bourgh asks Oliver if he plays the pianoforte and why didn't they have a governess, and how did their mother manage with all of them without a governess. And I'm like, I get it. I get it, okay? You're giving us the same exact retelling, but it came down to having the same questions, the same quotes, the same dialogues about the same topics. Like, it got to be too much. And what made it even worse for me personally, I don't know if you have noticed that, but I'm going to say it out loud so it's even more evident and clear and just so freaking obvious. I have read Pride and Prejudice. I've read the book, I think either once or twice, and I've watched the movie countless times. And even I know that there are some things in the book that are not in the movie, because of course the movie is much shorter, so they kind of have to condense all the information and focus on the most important elements and parts of the story. And it seems odd to me that the retelling of Pride and Prejudice, the book, chose to focus on the exact same things that the 2005 movie with Keira Knightley chose to focus on. I don't know why it annoyed me that much, but when I was listening to the audiobook and we were at the Netherfield Ball and Mr. Collins was dancing with Oliver, and then Oliver switches partner and dances with Darcy, you know that iconic scene in the 2005 movie where Keira Knightley and Matthew, what was his name? When Elizabeth is dancing with Darcy at the ball and then everything else in the background disappears and it's just the two of them, you know, going around the room and looking at each other and the camera is moving. You know that scene, right? Listening to the audiobook, it felt exactly like that. Like, that's the mental image that I had in my mind. That's what the book was making me picture. That's how the description was going, right? And so the whole time I was reading the book, I was thinking, are you giving me a retelling of the Pride and Prejudice classic, or are you giving me a retelling of the 2005 Pride and Prejudice movie with Keira Knightley? I don't know, it just annoyed me because not only does it feel like you push it a bit too much, like it almost feels like copying instead of retelling, but then you're not even retelling the book, you're retelling the movie. I mean, at least that's what it felt to me. Again, I could be totally wrong about this. If you have read the book, let me know in the comments. And to make it worse, not only you are retelling the story, as in writing it in the same exact way, don't get me wrong, of course the author had to change a few things here and there because we have a trans boy main character, so of course there are going to be a few, very few scenes here and there that are not in the original book. For instance, where Oliver goes to the Molly house, which is a place where queer people could, you know, historically speaking, could be themselves and be openly queer in a protected space. At least I'm speaking mostly for men. We don't know if, historically speaking, it was a safe space for queer women as well. Anyways, that's not the point here. Or for instance, when Oliver goes outside dressed as himself and he meets Darcy and Bingley. Those, of course, are scenes that are not in the original book. It's specific to Most Ardently. But the majority, let's say 85 to 90% of the book was exactly like the original story, especially considering the fact that most characters do not know that Oliver is Oliver, so they refer to him as Elizabeth. I mean, some of them will find out later in the book, Oliver will come out to them, but for the majority of the book, they still refer to him as Elizabeth. So you have that added element of, oh, is exactly like the original story. But let me go back to the train of thought that I was following. The author is kind of following very closely the original story of Pride and Prejudice, but then you have these inconsistencies that are inconsistencies for no reason. The author made Mr. Collins even dumber and more annoying and a much more dislikable character to the readers, which, like, he was already a very dislikable character. Why are you making it so much worse? Like, what's the point? And the other inconsistency is that the author kept Mrs. Bennet and how she is in the original story exactly the same for most of the book. And then at the very, very ending of the book, something happens and Mrs. Bennet acts in a completely uncharacteristic way. And I get it, in a book that is filled, unfortunately due to the historical setting, is filled with homophobia, with transphobia, with gender dysphoria, with dead naming, like with all that. You want characters, particularly his family, to stand for him, to protect him, to accept him for who he is. But then change Mrs. Bennet, write her in a different way from the very beginning. Like, don't have a character be exactly like the original for basically the whole book and then have her do a 180 at the very end just because you want that. You want the happy ending and you want her to be happy for the son and all of that. Like, that feels like not poor writing, but poor planning of how you want to tell your story and where you want it to go. Because, you know, you should have sprinkled different things like seeds and clues here and there to get to that conclusion, and you didn't. You just have a character acting very uncharacteristically for how they've been written for the whole thing, and it just, I don't know. It just annoyed me. Also, and that is something very specific to Most Ardently, so it has nothing to do with the original story and Pride and Prejudice, Oliver is a trans boy, right? So, you know, again, considering the historical setting, a very tough place to be in. He has to wear dresses and corsets even though they make him physically sick, because he does not want to look at his chest, he does not want to see his curves, he wants to look like a boy, he wants to dress like a boy because he is a boy, and he has to pretend most of the time, even with his family, even within his own home, that he is a girl when he's actually a boy. And that must be traumatic and terrible and tough on him and everything you want to say. However, for some reason, he still manages to be extremely privileged in the way that he acts, in the way that he thinks, and in the way that he is such a shitty friend to Charlotte. Charlotte in this book has a female lover. She is a married woman. The husband is away at war or something, and so they get to, you know, spend together a lot of time, especially when Charlotte is still unmarried. And whenever Oliver goes to Charlotte's house and they talk about marriage and how they're different and how to be themselves and all that, Charlotte, like any good friend would do, I feel like, tries to tell him, this is who you are and I accept you and I respect who you are, but what is your life plan? You know, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Because you, to most of the world, are a woman and therefore have to marry a man in order to have a house, in order to have someone that, you know, will sustain you, financially speaking, right? Because even though it sucks, that's our history. We are in England in the 1800s. Women had to marry, even though they didn't want to have a roof over their heads, you know, because they couldn't stay home with their family. Like, they had to go out and marry someone they perhaps despised because that someone, the husband, would pay for their shit. That's how it worked. And poor Charlotte is even worse off than Oliver or than Elizabeth was when it comes to money. So she has to marry a man, even though she has a female lover, even though she would want to marry her female lover, but it is not possible because that's our history, that's how it works. And Oliver, instead of understanding where Charlotte is coming from, instead of saying, oh, she's worried for me. She's trying to tell me that, I need to be realistic. I need to have a plan. I need to know what my future is going to be like and try to find a way to still be myself in that future. He takes it as if Charlotte is not accepting him. Charlotte is telling him to be a woman. Charlotte is telling him so, and so, when that's not what's happening. Meanwhile, he's acting as if that's not a real problem, as if Charlotte is not, being brave enough to go out of her way to be with her lover, and she possibly cannot understand what he's going through because she's a woman and she doesn't have to pretend to be someone else just because she doesn't feel like she's a man. Like, what the hell are you saying? Like, she's a woman in 1800s London. It's not easy to be her, particularly because in this book, she's also queer. She's not just a woman, she's a queer woman who has a relationship and is in love with another woman. What are you actually saying, you privileged, misogynistic man? If you want to make it a competition between a trans boy and a queer woman, okay, but I don't think that's the point of being queer and being part of the same community and trying to be like allies between each other. Like, what are we doing? Like, what are we actually doing here? I don't get it, but it frustrated me so much. Like, I really hated Oliver in that moment. Like, I don't know what the author was trying to do there, but like, I don't get it. I don't know. So yeah, there was that whole wonderful thing going on there, but let's move on from strictly talking about Most Ardently, and let's bring up Gwen Art Are Not in Love by Lex Croucher. This is the book that I would like all of us to keep in mind while I say what I'm about to say. First, why did I choose this book? I chose this book because it is another queer YA retelling. I've read many retellings of Pride and Prejudice, but I think all of them were adult fiction retellings, and the only most recent queer retelling that I've read that does, I want to say, almost the exact opposite of what Most Ardently does is Gwen Art Are Not in Love. Gwen Art is a retelling of the Arthurian myth. We have clear and also frequent references to Guinevere and Arthur, to Merlin, to Morgana. In Gwen Art, we have wars, we have romance, we have a medieval setting that is basically, I want to say, almost the same of the actual Arthurian legend, and yet it's completely different. It's something else entirely, even though the characters from the original myth are mentioned, even though they're there. Particularly if you're well accustomed, if you have read the source material, you'll be able to see and catch all the references and all the nudges to the source material itself. The book, Gwen Art, is entirely different. It has its own story, it has its own characters, it has its own narrative plot, it has different character developments. It does something entirely different. I mean, this one specifically, I appreciated the fact that Gwen and Art do not end up together. So there is also a different ending. You don't have something to look forward to. It is all about unknowing. It is all about being surprised. It is all about anticipation of what's to come next, and all about what the book has in store for you. Now, clearly my feelings regarding Most Ardently are pretty clear. I gave this book 3 stars. I liked it. It was okay. I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the writing. I loved the audiobook experience. I loved the voice narrator. But as you might have seen, I did have a few issues with it, and that's why I gave it 3 stars. It was okay, but it was very far from perfect. I want to put that on the side though. What is a good retelling for you? What makes a story a good retelling? Because Most Ardently is the type of retelling that stays very close to the source material, and we have other retellings like that where, you have the same characters, the same names, or sometimes different names and different settings, but you can clearly, pinpoint who is supposed to be Elizabeth and who is supposed to be Darcy. If we take the Pride and Prejudice classic as a reference, you know what the ending is going to be. You know that that book's Darcy and that book's Elizabeth will end up together. Like, you know more or less how the story is going to play out, and the enjoyment from reading that sort of retelling comes from, reading a story that you love, that that you will love, and seeing, those tiny different details that do actually change, and how the author decided to play with those tiny things that do actually change from the original story. On the other side, you have retellings like Gwen Art, where yes, it is clear that that book is a retelling of that specific book, of that specific story, so the source material is pretty evident, but when it comes to the actual book that you're reading, everything else is different. Like, there are those references here and there, but then the author just goes bonkers and does whatever they want to do with the story and the source material and just creates something entirely different. I honestly do not have a preference. I think it depends on my state of mind in that moment. It depends on what kind of story I'm looking forward to read in that specific moment. I think I can enjoy a retelling where I know how it's going to play out, and that's what I like about it, and it's just like a comfortable story to read. But I also love retellings like Gwen Art, where you don't know where the story is going to go. You don't know where the references will be. You don't know what the author is going to do with those characters. I think Most Ardently kind of missed the point because he did a bit too much of that sort of retelling, that category, but I do enjoy both things, and I would love to know what you enjoy reading. What retelling do you like to read more? Do you like to stay close to the source material in the story, or do you like the authors to play more with the source material that they are referring to? And I would love to know what are the best retellings that you've read so far. What are the retellings that you think I should go and read right now? And also, I would like to ask you, have you read other books in the Remixed Classics series? Because there are others that are on my TBR, like Travelers Along the Way, which I think could be a retelling of Robin Hood? I'm not sure, but I know that that title is on my list, and now I'm a bit hesitant. I don't know what I'm going to think about it if and when I do pick it up. I'm not as familiar with the Robin Hood retelling, that's true, but you know, I'm a bit hesitant. Anyways, I would love for you to tell me in the comments down below what you think. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was long and so much fun to film, and I thank you so much for watching it. I will see you very soon in my next one. Until then, have a good one, take care, and keep reading queer books. Bye! Warm hugs! Okay.